Suggestions for further reading. Craft. Stephen King on Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. E.M. Forster, Aspects of the Novel. John Gardner, The Art of Fiction, Notes on Craft for Young Writers. Barry Tarshis, How to Write Like a Pro. Each of these 4 books is very different and useful in its own ways. At times, they all offer contrasting information and approaches to the tack taken in this series of lessons. Had I found that contrasting information useful, I'd have included it. What I did find essential, I referenced in the appropriate lessons. You will find many overlapping ideas from mechanics in these 4 titles. King writes mostly from personal experience and seemingly his intuitive understanding of how to get the job done. For the most part, he's usually right. Forster's lectures are also largely intuitive, yet it's hard to ignore the insights of such a gigantic literary figure. A quick and useful read. Gardner tends to vacillate between the concrete and the metaphorical realms, and like most craft guides, I find myself disagreeing with the information presented about as often as I agree. But when Gardner hits the mark, he nails it. Tarshis's book, much discussed in my section on the text, is actually a guide to writing commercial nonfiction, but his incremental approach is so no-nonsense and useful that I can't help but recommend it to all writers. It may be out of print, but it can and should still be had. His emphasis on clarity and the reader's focus is something every writer should read and heed. Narrative. Seymour Chapman, Story and Discourse, Narrative Structure in Fiction and Film. Mary Lore Ryan, Narrative as Virtual Reality, Immersion and Interactivity in Literature and Electronic Media. Also by Mary Lore Ryan, Possible Worlds, Artificial Intelligence and Narrative Theory. David Herman, Story Logic, Problems and Possibilities of Narrative. And Gerard Genette, Narrative Discourse, an Essay in Method. Let's face it, it takes a special type of literary geek to geek out to narrative theory. If you're intrigued enough by mechanics to think that you might be one of those special people, allow me to try to scare you off one last time by stating that most narrative texts are dry, not particularly well written, and probably could be considered a kind of torture by various humanitarian organizations worldwide. However, if you're still insistent that you'd like to learn more, I've ordered this list as best I could to get a beginner properly oriented as painlessly as possible. Chapman's book is both readable and covers the basics as broadly and as clearly as any text written since. Mary Lore Ryan's 2 greatest works are among the best books ever written on plot, specifically, but also narrative in general. Possible Worlds is more technical than Narrative as Virtual Reality, so I think it might be better to read the latter first, as adopting to the vocabulary and mindset of a narrative theorist is probably best done the way French chefs boil frogs. If you get through Possible Worlds and are still intrigued, you might be ready for the hard stuff. David Herman is a wonderful scholar, and Story Logic is probably the best of the cognitive titles in the world of narrative theory, but Herman does not read easy. This is no beach book, and so too with Genette. But Narrative Discourse is probably the most foundational book ever written in the field. It is a slog, and a confusing slog at times. If you make it through this, though, congratulations on becoming one of the initiated, geek. Syntax and Sentences. Steven Pinker, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. Lynn Truss, Eat Shoots and Leaves, The Zero-Tolerance Approach to Punctuation. Brooks Landon, Building Great Sentences. Virginia Tufte, Artful Sentences, Syntax as Style. Of all the sections in mechanics, I feel like the lessons on the text are the place where I had to omit reams of useful material for the sake of not writing 3-hour lectures. I tried to balance the construction of a solid, comprehensive, systematic approach to sentence writing against the patience of an audience I suspect will be much more interested in the other 5 sections of these lessons. But I can't stress enough that the text is where the class of a writer is immediately apparent or apparently lacking. Part of what made me comfortable leaving out material here was the existence of such great writing and lecturing on the subject elsewhere. Each of the 4 titles mentioned here will deepen any writer's knowledge base when it comes to different aspects of the text. Pinker's approach to grammar and style is extremely comprehensive, approachable, and is based in the best current knowledge we have about how language and the mind work. Truss's best-selling book on punctuation, yes, you heard that correctly, is so damn funny that it makes reading about punctuation downright pleasurable, at least for a book nerd. I also can't say enough about Brooks Landon's lecture series on sentence writing. My only caveat is that one may walk away with Landon's bias towards loose modifiers as the end-all be-all in sentence construction, which is why I've included Tufte's review of the whole scope of sentence greatness. It's not a work you can absorb in an afternoon, but in doses, Artful Sentences is top class. All 4 of these titles should be compulsory for every serious writer. Linguistics. Steven Pinker, The Language Instinct, How the Mind Creates Language. John McWhorter, The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language. Also John McWhorter. Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English. Mechanics didn't go nearly as deep into the linguistics weed as I could have done in several places. Many writers tend to be fascinated with language, but I've come across my fair share of our kind who might roll their eyes at the suggestion they should read a book about linguistics. So I'll leave the deep dive type stuff to the experts, with whom the subject matter properly belongs. Both McWhorter and Pinker qualify as experts, and as an added bonus, they both possess that rare gift of making what could be difficult and dry material both accessible and interesting. The Language Instinct is still the best foundational book on linguistics outside of a textbook, and the 2 McWhorter titles I'm including on this list track the history of language in general and the history of English. All 3 suffice to give a layperson an excellent baseline understanding of a very complex field. Psychology and Human Nature. Keith Oatley, Such Stuff as Dreams, The Psychology of Fiction. Steven Pinker, The Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into Human Nature. Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Robert Sapolsky, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. I'm sure you won't be too shocked to hear that I'm fascinated by the human mind. That's part of why I started writing fiction, as a vehicle for exploring the human condition and our great diversity of cultures and environments. But I think you need a bit more ammunition going into such territory than your gut instincts if you're going to be any good at exploring human nature. Great novelists of the past were deeply steeped in multitudes of philosophical traditions, and none of that material would do much to hold a writer back, by my reckoning. Yet I can't help but think that writers like Tolstoy or Hawthorne, or especially Emily Dickinson, would have given their left arm for a peek into the 4 books I've included here. Oatley, in addition to being a capable novelist himself, is the world's leading expert in the psychology of written fiction. Such Stuff as Dreams offers an insightful tour into the reasons people read and write fiction, no small matter to the serious writer. The other 3 titles are here to offer a window into human nature more generally. The Stuff of Thought explores how language interacts with and reveals the inner workings of our psychology, all presented in a way only Pinker can offer. I've drawn from it directly in several places in Mechanics. Haidt's groundbreaking book, Into the Nature of Moral Psychology, is so understated in its tone and is so accessible that one might make the mistake of forgetting they're reading a work so foundational that people will still be learning from it for decades to come. Moral foundations are often the framework for human behavior, and understanding these foundations may fundamentally change the way you think about character motivation. And if you're ever tempted to think that human behavior is a simple matter, Robert Sapolsky will disabuse you of that notion thoroughly, and in the process he'll leave you with a sense of wonder at the depth of complexity in both our physical world and in the mind that perceives and acts in it. Each of the titles listed here is as much a doorway to a deeper world to be further explored as it is a link back to this series of lessons on the mechanics of fiction writing. Sound these depths and your writing and thinking will be sharper for it. Never stop exploring, never stop improving.